So I am very excited to chat with today's guest, Andrea Nakayama, as we're going to be chatting about functional nutrition and, of course, tying this into thyroid autoimmunity. So Andrea is a functional medicine nutritionist and educator who has led thousands of clients and now teaches even more coaches and clinicians around the world in a revolution, reclaiming ownership of both their own and their clients' health. As the host of the 15-minute. Actually, let's interrupt. So, do you want me to still say that part,
Yep, it's still
even though you're
there.
not
Yes.
the host? Okay, okay, just
Well, I mean,
okay.
I am. It's still there, so
It's
people
still
can
there. It's
go
still out
and
there. Okay, okay. The editor,
yes,
of course, will cut out this part, but you just threw me off because you just said you're no longer there. But
yes.
again, okay. I okay. So, as the host of the 15-Minute Matrix podcast and a founder and former CEO of Functional Nutrition Alliance, Andrea draws on systems biology, mental models, root cause methodology, and the therapeutic partnership to offer long awaited solutions for the rapidly growing chronic illness epidemic. And after losing her young husband to a brain tumor in 2002, she discovered a passion for using food as personalized medicine and is now regularly consulted as a nutrition expert for the toughest clinical cases in the practices of many world renowned doctors. She trains nearly 4,000 practitioners each year in her methodology so that they too can become the last stop for their clients and patients, as well as a trusted referral partner for doctors in their area. And Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
I am so excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, same here. Looking forward to it. And let's go ahead and let's just dive into your background. I know that you have a history of Hashimoto. So if you could talk a little bit about that and then how you started getting into functional nutrition, which I kind of gave a little bit of that background during the
Yeah.
bio, but if you could expand on that.
Yeah, as you said in the bio, my husband was diagnosed with a brain tumor when I was 7 weeks pregnant back in April of 2000. And that really catapulted an awareness of what was happening in the medical space, right? Prior to that, in our early 30s, we hadn't really ever been in the medical system. Maybe we had gone to a doctor for a thing or two, but we hadn't been in the system. So that really became a wake up call for me in terms of where the system excels, the medical system, and where there are some gaps in the system and what we could do to fill those gaps. So I think of that time with my late husband, Disamu, as my boot camp in nutrition and in all integrative practices. But it wasn't until many years after he died that I decided to change my own career, put myself back through school, many years of training, and then really create a practice, and then a practice that was actually doing so well that other practitioners were asking me what I was doing. And so I realized how I had to kind of take off the model that I was practicing and be able to teach it to others. During that time, as you said, I myself realized that I had autoimmune thyroid issues. I had Hashimoto's. It took a long time to get that diagnosis. But in retrospect, with all I know now, it's no surprise because there was a lot of stress for me going on during one of the biggest triggers for an autoimmune condition, which is pregnancy. And so I wasn't only pregnant, I was pregnant with a lot of stress given my husband's diagnosis and illness. So that was quite a journey that both led to my own health issues and discovery simultaneous to reshaping my own career and aiming to fill these gaps that I had identified in the medical system.
Yeah, so you were diagnosed with Hashimoto's during your pregnancy or after your pregnancy then?
Years after the pregnancy. So I think while I was pregnant, we changed our diet for the brain tumor. And so, I was in my quote unquote skinny jeans 2 weeks after I gave birth. Because there was a lot I was doing to support my body, but I also look back and can see the underpinnings of an autoimmune condition brewing, not just during that time, but prior to that. But it took years for things to manifest in a more obvious way, and even more years to actually get the diagnosis that I already knew was true.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's pretty typical with autoimmune
Yes.
conditions, especially Hashimoto's, where someone it'll be underlying for quite a long time. And then even when someone experiences symptoms, a lot of times I'll just look at a TSH. TSH might be within the lab range, and doctor will
Exactly.
dismiss it. Where, yeah, so it's unfortunate, but again, that's why you're doing what you're doing now, and just helping other practitioners as well, just based on the unfortunate experience that you had with your husband. But again, you've turned that into helping thousands of practitioners. And can you talk about functional nutrition, what exactly that is? Because people listening to this, I'm sure they're familiar with functional medicine, and there's different different terms out there. So if you can kind of like maybe compare the different terms, even like what's the
Yeah.
difference between functional nutrition and functional medicine?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think that it's a word that's gotten away from us in a lot of ways. So I'm going to bring us back to the foundations. And you mentioned some of them in the bio as well. So the three primary tenets of a functional practice are a therapeutic partnership, looking for the root causes, which means we ask why, not what, and a systems based approach, which embraces systems biology. And I always like to say, as well as a systematic way of working. How do we work in systems so we know how to approach each person as an individual? So, those three tenets were at the basis of what was designed as functional medicine back in the 90s, with Dr. Jeffrey Bland and many others really understanding the basis of systems biology. And when I say that, I mean, as we know now, the gut's connected to the brain, and the gut's connected to the liver, which is connected to detoxification, which is connected to our hormones. Understanding that internal terrain, I like to say everything is connected. Understanding that is the premise at the core of a functional practice. Now, if we look at the differences between functional medicine and functional nutrition, it's really about what the tools in our toolbox are. So, for a functional medicine doc, they are still diagnosing and they're still prescribing, and that's within their scope of practice. And there is an awareness of diet and lifestyle modification, but I think it's run away from itself a little bit in terms of scope of practice. And what we do in functional nutrition is we double click on the realities of diet and lifestyle modification. And I like to say that nutrition is about growth, metabolism, and repair. So it's not just about the food we eat or don't eat, it's also about sleep and relaxation, exercise and movement, hydration as well as nutrition, stress and resilience, relationships and networks. All of those things feed our growth, metabolism, and repair and impact what we can or can't do with the food we eat. And so for me, the nutrition piece is a double click, meaning, we're opening up that Pandora's box of what it actually means to make this kind of change. And I always like to say nutrition isn't a handout. Dietary change isn't a handout, especially when we're talking about women, especially when we're talking about this time in history with anti diet culture and body positivity. There's an intersection of where we have to look at the role that diet plays and what's going on with your health and your health outcomes that takes a level of counseling, which is the role of a functional nutrition counselor. And I want to say, which should be the role of a functional nutrition counselor, because I'm seeing the word functional thrown out a lot to mean testing. And to me, that's not what functional nutrition is. I'm not anti testing, but there's a lot of other work that we can be doing that makes the practice of functional nutrition much more accessible to every and all individual, as opposed to a concierge high cost practice where we get lots of tests, treat to a test, take lots of supplements, and shop at Whole Foods. Like, that's not what functional nutrition is to me. So I hope that explains the difference between functional medicine and functional nutrition. And I think there's a real need for more functional nutrition counselors who can think in these ways.
Yeah, so it sounds like ideally functional nutrition should fall under that functional medicine paradigm, but many practitioners overdo it with the testing and the diagnosis. Like they focus more on that and don't really dive deeper into the health history and into the diet and lifestyle as they should be. Am I
Yes.
understanding that correctly?
Yes, really understanding, like, what does it mean to get to the roots? What are the roots? What are our influencers with those roots, as opposed to looking for the root in a test? That's not where the root lives. The root lives in the history, like you're saying, into the timeline, into the matrix. Who are you? You are an expert in you, and I'm going to learn way more about you by spending time with you than by looking at a piece of paper or any other scale or measure of who you are. They both might be needed, but we're bypassing the most important evidence in the room.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I admit I do testing my practice, but I really consider myself to be more on the conservative side. There are some practitioners who will recommend, a few thousand dollars worth of testing to pretty much every one of their patients. And I know some practitioners that say if they don't get that, like if they don't go through all the testing, they can't become a patient. And with me, I'm more on the conservative side. And even if a person can't afford the conservative testing, I would never say, well, the person can't become a patient, because I also want to look at the health history and dive into the diet and lifestyle too. So that's great that you're saying that. So, and I appreciate that honesty. And it's great again that you're teaching, your practitioner is the one that you've been teaching for so many years that as well. So we met at an IFM conference, and at IFM Institute for Functional Medicine, they talk about antecedents, triggers, and mediators. So I wanted you to kind of dive into those and maybe tie that into thyroid autoimmunity. I know you had your history of Hashimoto's, as we discussed. Also, a lot of people who listen to this have Graves' disease. So, I mean, of course,
Yep.
those apply really to any chronic condition, not just Hashimoto's or Graves or autoimmunity for that matter. But yeah, if you could talk about those, Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say to your last point or our last point about the labs, I also love labs. I love them when I need more information. And a lot of times we have enough information to work with before we need that added information. And that's where I think there's a mistake. But I also use and love labs. I think it's just how they're being used and where we're bypassing the regular labs we can get from our doctors, what's coming in there. There's a lot of information there that sometimes point out to in the instance of hydration, and where we could be focusing on hydration and change everything else just by changing how much water somebody consumes. All those other test results are going to change. And so I just wanted to point out, like, yes to the labs when we need more information, at least from a functional nutrition perspective. So back to our ATMs, or our antecedents, triggers, and mediators. So, what I'm going to talk about is two models that I think into. So, when I think about a case, I'm always looking through three different tools that I've created that are based on IFM tools to begin with. So, for one is the functional nutrition matrix, which is an offshoot of the functional medicine matrix. So in that matrix, there's three sections, and they relate to everything is connected, we are all unique, and all things matter. So everything is connected is that systems biology. We are all unique are those ATMs, and that's related to who we are and what's individual about us. So our antecedents are our genes, yes, but we don't need to get genetic testing. We can talk about our family history. We can talk about who we are, where we've come from. It's also when we were born, where we were born, how we were born, what order we were born in. There's a lot of good information in those antecedents that tell us, like, where did you come from? What did you not affect in your life? It was just part of what came with you. And that's what we're gathering with our antecedents. It could be your genes, it could be your polymorphisms. We could capture that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be those types of genes that people are looking for right now. It could just be what you know about your genes. Our triggers are the things that have happened throughout our life, positive and negative, that have impacted where we are today. So for me, the ATMs are really about our timeline, and there is gold in a patient's timeline. If somebody says to you, I've always had trouble sleeping, my question to them is, tell me about your first memory of having trouble sleeping. I'm not just making a recommendation or putting them in a sleep study, because there's actual information and triggers that we can identify from their childhood that could be a part of the story. So our triggers are things that have happened again through our life. It could be food poisoning, or traveling out of the country, or a virus, or taking antibiotics. It's what we can look at and say, I think there was a before and an after this point. When you were asking me my story, I told you that pregnancy is often a trigger for autoimmunity, such as Hashimoto's or Graves'. And it's because of the shifts that are happening in our immune system during that time. And then I had other triggers, huge stressors on top of that trigger. So those for me are part of my story and my triggers. Our mediators are my favorite part of the matrix. They're related to what I call the skills, and they're where we know what makes us feel better and what makes us feel worse. And so we get to put a plus or a minus next to the things that we know about ourselves. And my goal as a functional nutritionist is to help people know more of their mediators. Once we know more of our mediators, we have more agency over our own health, because we're making a risk reward decision each and every day with each and every choice that we make, as opposed to being in the big unknown and relying on a provider to tell us what we should or shouldn't. So ATMs are the antecedents, triggers, and mediators. And I love spending time there. In fact, all my work going forward in the book I'm writing, it's about the ATMs, because the ATMs are our story. And I really love the opportunity to bring people into that story. It's a little corny, but I like to think of it as the oh me instead of the why me, which is a lot of the place we tend to be in with autoimmunity, because it's so confusing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And so you mentioned in some cases, obviously not in all cases, as far as pregnancy being a trigger, but would you agree that the antecedents could be the reason why in some cases it could be a trigger if someone, not only the genetics, but if someone born via C-section and they weren't breastfed as a baby, had a history in childhood of antibiotics and all that accumulation led to the point where it wasn't, in a way, not the pregnancy itself, but everything leading up to the
Correct.
pregnancy that caused that to be that trigger?
Correct. So there's never one trigger, just like there's never one root. So the model that I've created is what I call three roots, many branches. And this is based on the work of Dr. Alessio Fasano, who created the three-legged stool of autoimmunity. So my three roots, many branches allows patients to think into any sign, symptom, or diagnosis as a branch. So if we can visualize a tree, we can think of any sign, symptom, or diagnosis: Hashimoto's, Graves', bloating, migraines, restless leg, whatever it is. That's a branch on our tree. And we can address that branch, and that's hopefully or often what we're going to our medical doctors for. But in functional nutrition, we're not only going deeper into the trunk and deep down to the roots, we're focusing on the soil that the roots exist in or live in. So for me, the three roots for any chronic condition, which encompasses all autoimmune conditions, are the genes or the genetic predisposition, digestion, and inflammation. Those are the roots. If we have an autoimmune condition, I'm going to tell everybody we have to look at all three roots, but we can't do anything about the roots. So what I've done is create a circle of influence that surrounds each of those roots that gives us a little bit more agency. And so around the genes, there's a circle of influence, which are our epigenetic factors. Around the digestion, there's a circle of influence. And around inflammation, there's a circle of influence. And that gives us a little bit more of an idea of where do I go? What do I do? But to your point, Eric, yes, it's never one trigger and you are never to blame. It's again understanding, oh, this is what set me up for this. And this is just the tipping point versus I did that and therefore it's my fault.
Thanks for that explanation. And yeah, I agree. There's usually, if not always, multiple factors, multiple triggers. And so when getting back to nutrition, functional nutrition, how big of a role does that play in your opinion when it comes to I don't know if you want to use the word reverse autoimmunity or just have someone regain their health. I mean, obviously, it plays a big role, but I guess to reword it another way, can just diet alone, nutrition alone, can that help to alter the course of Hashimoto's, Graves' disease, all these other chronic conditions?
Well, I'm going to give you the answer I give most of my students, and then I'll talk into it. So when I say to my students, what's my favorite answer? They will answer, it depends, right? So, of course, because I'm a functional medicine nutritionist, I believe in the powers of food. And yet, from a functional nutrition perspective, food is this object outside of our bodies. It's just coffee is coffee, wine is wine, bread is bread. It's the intersection or the symbiosis of where food meets physiology when it comes to functional nutrition. So I'm looking at how does this food or the elimination of this food impact your body and your brain. So, for instance, we can talk about specific foods and is it ideal for the healing of the internal system to eliminate a food? Yes. If that elimination causes a tremendous amount of stress, is that stress also detrimental to your health? Yes. And so I'm looking at the whole picture, but I always believe that there is a place for dietary interventions in addition to the powers of the internal healing.
That's a good response, and I'm glad you said it depends because I see it all the time too. I mean, there are people where all they'll do is eliminate gluten, and that seems like that's enough to get into remission and to feel
Correct.
great again. And then there are people who follow whatever type of diet, whether it's paleo or AIP diet, or and they still feel lousy, and maybe that's just not the perfect diet for them because there really isn't a perfect diet that fits everyone. So that's one answer. But then there could be other factors, whether it's the chronic
Correct.
stress that they're dealing with or the infection. So yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I don't know if you want to expand on that, but I wanted to ask you: do you have like a favorite diet? Speaking of like paleo, and there's ketogenic and carnivore and AIP. Do you have one that you recommend to most people with autoimmunity, or does it really depend on the person as far as what you're going to recommend?
Yeah. For me, it really depends. And I do not, what I do for myself is not what I recommend to others. And I don't think dietary intervention is a prescription. And my goal, and I'll tell you my principles for what we could be looking at, but my goal is for people to eat the most diverse diet that is possible for them at any one point in time. And all of those factors are going to change over time if we're really looking at nutrition. So when I think about that, those areas of influence, that soil I was talking about that surrounds the roots, if we look at the root of genes and our epigenetic factors, the factors that influence the expression of our genes, that includes food, movement, environment, and mindset. And then each of those, I can look at their circle of influence. So for food, I'm going to think about quality, quantity, diversity, and timing. And all of those are going to be different depending on the individual. So if I were to say intermittent fasting, it's the bomb, but I'm talking to somebody who has blood sugar issues and dysregulation and is up in the night, intermittent fasting is going to be problematic. If we say ketogenic diets are the way to lose weight and everybody's going on ketogenic diets, but they have problems digesting fats, or they don't have a gallbladder, we're causing more issues based on these theories versus looking at the individual. And again, that's not functional to me. And so the principles that I'd rather invite people into around how they eat are three. I always talk in threes, if you haven't noticed, lots of threes, sometimes fours, but certainly fat, fiber, and protein. Every meal should include fat, fiber, and protein. Now, of course, there's deeper conversations about what does that mean? How does that feel? But that's going to help with our balancing of our blood sugar, our metabolism. And we have to start at least playing like that, bringing to awareness, not how am I eating in accordance to a theory or a prescription, because that's a diet and nobody will stick to it, or barely anybody will stick to it. But if we start to bring awareness to, wait, I'm actually choosing this not because it was listed on a piece of paper, what I should be eating and buying, but because I'm bringing awareness to what I'm eating. So fat, fiber, protein. Number two is eat the rainbow. And again, like, this is just something to have fun with. How many colors did I get in my day? I don't care if it's 3 blueberries and it goes in blue or purple. Just start to have fun with your food and awareness, and that will crowd out some of the other foods as you start to play around with that. And the third principle is to have your yes, no, maybe list. And your yes, no, maybe list relates to those mediators we were talking about, but it also brings people into awareness of what they know works for them, what they know doesn't work for them, because I guarantee you people know some of those things, and then start to ask questions. What am I unsure about? You know, every time I eat broccoli, it feels different. Sometimes it feels like this, sometimes it feels like that. I don't know. Should I be eliminating broccoli? Put it on your maybe list. Focus where you do know for a minute, and then you start to experiment. So I think what I'm trying to introduce is more of a ownership and a relationship versus a set of uh, set principles that put people on in a healing diet protocol, many of which should not be done for long periods of time, but are, because people don't know how else to live.
Yeah. So I agree as far as diversity, definitely important. And it also sounds like certain foods you recommend avoiding, like things that could be mediators such as gluten. I imagine you tell or advise people with Hashimoto's and other autoimmune conditions to avoid it, or are you saying that just by introducing all the other like healthy foods that it's going to kind of push out those common allergens, like without saying
Well,
specifically avoid
no.
gluten or avoid dairy?
No, I mean, that would be nice, but that's not how it works. So, as you and I both know, and I'm sure your audience knows, there are certain foods like gluten and others that have the potential to act as molecular mimics in the body that can exacerbate our immune system. So, for me, non negotiable, personally, non negotiable to eliminate gluten. What I've done in the last few years is work with more populations of people who have chronic illness, but also have really troubled relationships with histories of diets and dieting, or body or dysmorphia. So I've worked with a group of transgender practitioners. I worked with military practitioners who don't have options to make changes that we would think of as ideal. So that's really informed the way I talk about diet. If you and I were talking as practitioners, and if I have the opportunity to educate about gluten, yes, there's an entire class in my digestive intensive about the interactions of gluten in the body. And I want people to understand those connections so they're in that risk reward relationship. However, I am cautious about starting with dietary eliminations for people who may have more complicated relationships with food, with dieting, and with their bodies. So I've certainly worked with people with Hashimoto's and Graves where the conversation about diet or food tracking is off the table for a little bit, and we have to think about other ways to enter while we warm up to the situation of talking about gluten. So I like to think of this as the ideal versus the heal. Ideally, with Graves or Hashimoto's or any autoimmune condition, because of those three roots, we're not eating gluten because gluten can impact our gut lining and our ability to, you know, receive things in our bloodstream that we don't need that impact our immune system. Yes, yes, yes. And there's certain ways in which food elimination are so triggering for people, I have learned. And a lot of people who have Hashimoto's because they've been on extreme diets that make me really want to rewrite the story about how we usher into conversations that are about being able to take agency for our own health. And so I hope that it's complicated. Yes to the elimination of gluten for Hashimoto's and Graves, ideally. And these are complicated conversations. And I just want to note that because there's so much anchoring on these quick diet changes these days that I think are putting a lot of pressure and shame on too many people who also have these conditions.
Yeah, I agree, and thank you. I think it makes sense. I mean, ideally, gluten should be a non-negotiable, but depends on the person. If someone's used to eating gluten all the time, I mean, depending on how the health history and conversation goes, you still might encourage them to avoid gluten. But if they're in a position where that's stressing them out, you might take it slow and gradual, even with the gluten, and try to work on incorporating healthier foods rather than focusing on the elimination. And I think it sounds like also that there's less non negotiables. Like, for example, AIP, and not to pick on AAP because I like autoimmune protocol, but eggs are not allowed for autoimmune protocol. So it sounds like you wouldn't tell every single autoimmune patient that they can't have eggs, because even though it's not part of autoimmune protocol for certain reasons, it's not the same as gluten, where gluten arguably causing an increase in intestinal permeability in everybody, inflammatory in everybody. Eggs are nutrient dense, and a lot of people do really well on eggs. So yeah, I think I really understand where you're going, and it makes sense to I
Yeah.
mean, you
Yeah.
yeah,
I was
I was
just
gonna
going to
say
say, like,
you're
from an, oh, go ahead.
no, that's okay. I was gonna say you're right in that the diet, like really strict diets do tend to stress out a good number of people, and that kind of defeats the purpose of the diet in the first place if they're going to follow a strict diet, but then really stressing every day, oh, when am I going to introduce the next food, or I can't do this more than a week or two, is what I was going to say.
Yeah, I was gonna just add two things and one like actual case study because it's often helpful to think through that lens. So I'm working with a case study group for the book I'm writing, which is focused on the timeline. I'm not their clinician because that's not a book, right? I can't be one on one. So we're working through some more principles. There's one person who has Hashimoto's. There's more than one person with Hashimoto's in the group, but there's one particular person who has Hashimoto's, and she's been to all the doctors. In fact, all of them have been to all the doctors and been on all the protocols, and they're still not better. So that then leads me to the what I love about the work. What's happening that that's the case? What's going on, and where's there a lack of understanding? And how do we get out of I know what to do, but I'm not doing it, to the reality that if you knew what to do and you really knew it, you would do it. Like what there's something missing in the education or in the implementation. So for this one person in particular, she had been on an autoimmune paleo protocol. It had felt better, but it had triggered all of her disordered eating and her control of every single thing she had to include. So even when I was saying we're going to food mood poop track, she couldn't track her food. When I was saying eat the rainbow, she would go to 8 cups a day. Like she couldn't be in the in between, in the small steps, because every step was a big step, a huge step. And that allowed her to be either in the all or nothing arena. And that all or nothing, neither were working for her and neither were helping her get to her full expression of health, because one helped her feel better physiologically, but was a lot of stress psychologically. And the other one was psychologically maybe feeling a little bit better, but was physiologically not working for her. She had to have a rock bottom moment, and I had to allow her to have a rock bottom moment where she was actually on the floor, vomiting, coming out both ends, her husband up and worried, her daughter up and worried, for her to say, I'm something has to shift. But she kept saying to me, gluten doesn't impact me. I don't have any digestive issues. She wrote me a week off of gluten and said, I don't know what I was thinking, that gluten wasn't impacting me. I can finally put my wedding ring back on my finger, and I haven't been able to in 3 years. That had to be her journey of ownership, so that she's not feeling shame or guilt around what she was doing and not doing. She was having a deeper sense of awareness. That's a more interesting, sustainable path for me, for people forward, than what is essentially becoming a diet. The other thing I want to say with some of these healing diets, whether they're low histamine or AIP or low oxalate, low lectin, these usually point to the fact that there is more healing that needs to be done internally so that the body can tolerate more foods. And none of those diets are meant to be done for a long term. Once we do those diets for a long term, we are usually introducing other nutrient deficiencies by what we are not including in the diet that can manifest as signs, symptoms, and even diagnoses. Now, eliminating gluten isn't going to lead to any nutrient deficiencies. So, that's the difference between a sustainable way of living versus some of these very restricted diets, which are not designed for long-term living. And people are getting narrower and narrower and narrower. In our clinic, we work with people who are like come in eating 3 foods for 3 years, and that they just don't know what's going on and they haven't done the internal healing. So you can tell I'm passionate about this. I think we're doing nutrition all wrong. And I feel like there's a lot more we could be doing to move in with each individual to their reality, their story around food and their body, and around making change to make it a sustainable change.
Yeah, I agree. And there's actually some research now, even with like ketogenic. I think there's at least one, if not multiple studies on long-term effects on the gut microbiome, just because you're not
For
eating a diverse
sure.
diet. And so I imagine it the same, or can definitely be the same with some of these other diets like carnivore. Not to pick on any specific diet, but at least with ketogenic it is in the research, so I could pick on that, even though again I'm not anti-ketogenic. But I
Correct.
but yeah, I agree with these diets. If you're going to do them, they're not meant to be permanent diets or even really long-term diets. But yeah, you make a good point. Again, getting back to the gluten, you're not going to have any nutrient deficiencies with giving up gluten, or giving up unhealthy oils, or some other
Correct.
you know foods or categories of foods. Whereas if you start restricting too many things, then you fall into that trap. And many times, yeah, anyway, like you said, I mean, the psychological effects that it has on the person, we can't overlook. So thank you so much for sharing that, Andrea.
Yeah. Yeah, and those
Yeah.
psychological effects have a physiological impact, and that is the truth of functional practice. Like I always say, I'm not a therapist. I like the physiology. For me, it's about what's going on in the body, and yet there's so many things that can happen that impact what's going on in our body. Our gut isn't just impacted by our food and probiotics. It's impacted by our sleep and our stress and our hydration and so many other things. And I just worry that we're missing those realities of the truth of systems biology when it comes to food and diet.
Yeah, it's true. Hydration, as you mentioned, that's big as well. A lot of people don't drink enough water, so they might focus on avoiding gluten, avoiding other common allergens, and doing what they feel is everything right from a dietary standpoint, but might maybe not drink enough water. I can't tell you how many times. One time was actually yesterday, a patient consultation where someone said, where I asked them, "Are you drinking enough water?" And they were honest and said, "No, I don't. I'm pretty sure I'm not drinking enough water." And that's I'm sure with on your side too, where you get a lot of people just saying that they're not staying well hydrated.
Yeah, and even before I eat, before I might know that, this is a place where I love serum labs. Again, not fancy labs, but serum labs. We can look at people's red blood function and see if they're potentially dehydrated and point that out and make the connection. So I'll have a lot of people who are complaining to me about fatigue. And if you look at a red blood cell function that's not functional, and they're not hydrated, we're not pumping enough blood and we're going to feel our energy depleted. And so making those simple connections for people, I like to think of it as the simplicity on the other side of complexity, because we think that the conversation about hydration or sleep, maybe that's a little too basic. I talk about the complex stuff, but I can talk to you about your hydration in relation to your energy and your oxidative stress. I can talk to you about your sleep and your microbiome. It's understanding the complexity of systems biology and yet understanding the realities of the core basics, which for me are on the right side of the matrix, which is why I keep using my hands. Those ATMs and those core basics.
Yeah, and that's a great point about the just like what's considered to be basic testing, like a CBC with differential or comprehensive metabolic panel. And again, unfortunately, a lot of doctors they just spend a few seconds just looking and seeing if everything's in range in the lab range, and then when it comes to like the RBC, if it's they're concerned if it's low, if someone has anemia, the low RBC, the low hemoglobin, low hematocrit, but if it's elevated, or if it's on the higher side, they might not pay attention to that, which, as you were suggesting, could suggest that someone has problems with hydration. So yeah, I definitely recommend all those tests, all the basic tests, and yeah. So thank you for sharing that as well. And what do you? Here's a question when it comes to the non-negotiables. I'll put you on the spot as far as dairy. What
Yeah.
do you consider dairy to be a non-negotiable when it comes to autoimmunity, or no?
I'll tell you my non-negotiables because I have like a, tier three tiers of nutrition mastery. Tier one are your non-negotiables. Your non-negotiables are sleep, poop, and blood sugar balance. So if dairy is impacting something, then we have to look at dairy as a non-negotiable, your yes, no, maybe list. But I do think people have different tolerances for dairy. I have some Hashi sisters, one which we were talking about earlier, who can't tolerate dairy at all. I can tolerate minimal dairy and it feels fine. I didn't tolerate dairy at all times. So I'm careful about what I choose. I don't eat cow dairy. I will eat goat and sheep dairy. I choose to ideally eat raw goat or sheep dairy, and I can't eat it regularly. I can put it in my what I call my bike lane. For those of you on the East Coast, that's the shoulder. I'm on the West Coast, so it's a bike lane. But we have our path, we have our poison ivy, and there's a place where we need a little wiggle room so that we're living. And so for me, dairy, it depends where we are in our healing journey, it depends who we are, and it depends what we're able to track and determine is working for us. Just like you said with eggs, I'm about the same with eggs as I am with dairy. It's not an everyday, it's on an occasion, and I'm selective about my source or my quality that I'm using when I do consume that food. And for me, I'm pretty tight about how I eat, but it allows me the wiggle room to at least take a whole food and make it an include in moderation as opposed to some notion of can't.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And just repeat your non-negotiables: sleeping, pooping, and balancing blood
Blood sugar
sugar.
balance. Mm-hmm.
All right. And yeah, and so dairy depends on the person and really everything except again, gluten obviously falls also in that non-negotiable as you mentioned, but yes, you definitely want to get sleep. That's another big problem. And then as far as regular bowel movements, what do you consider like two per day, three per day?
I mean, this is again, I want like so many of us with autoimmunity are like perfectionists, we're type A. So I don't want anybody like worrying about the perfect poop now. But yes, I like to think about form, function, and frequency when it comes to poop. So 1 to 3 times a day is nice, a well formed, easy to pass, no straining, but not urgent, brownish in color, not too light, not too dark. And that's our best diagnostic test for me is as a person, as a patient. Look in the bowl. What you got? How's it feel? And then how can you begin to see what makes a difference? If I eat more protein, does that impact my poop? If I eat more fiber, does it impact my poop? If I eat more fiber and I increase my hydration, does that impact my poop? And this is how we develop true sustainable relationships with our food and our dietary plan, just paying attention. That to me, again, like I think poop is our best diagnostic tool, but not through stool testing, through what's in the bowl.
So observe your poop before you
Totally.
spend before you spend not to say there's not a time and place for a conference of stool panel, but again, even before you do that, make sure just observe your poop, which I mean, it's good points. I mean, there is a lot you could tell by just observing not just the poop, but looking at like your tongue, just like look again, just really paying close attention. Like there are people that say, should I do testing for candida? And I'm not saying I never do that, but do you have, strong sugar cravings? Do you have, a thick white coating on the tongue and, other symptoms that might suggest that you might be able to find out without actually doing the testing. So yeah, I'm
Exactly.
glad we're having this conversation. And so one of the questions I want to ask you, since I know you work with a lot of practitioners, is some of the more important functional nutrition tips you give to the practitioners. So I don't know if what we already covered would be some of those tips that you give, or if there's anything else for any practitioners who might be listening to this, anything else we didn't cover that you would say to focus on, or any tips.
Yeah, for me, it's really about the understanding of what's going on in the body. So I've trained thousands of practitioners, and they may be surprised that I'm teaching physiology. I'm just teaching it through the lens of where food and lifestyle meet physiology. So even our nurses and doctors and chiropractors who come through my training will ask, is this going to be a repeat of what I already know? And then they come in and they're like, I knew the physiology, but I never thought of it like this. So for me, the biggest thing that I'm teaching people is what I call what's going on in there. When we understand how the body should function, we can see the clues to where we might need to move to make our recommendations. And then the top tools I'm going to use are the functional nutrition matrix, which again remind us everything is connected. We are all unique and all things matter. The three roots, many branches to help us think through where do I go now? And what I call the three tiers to nutrition mastery, which starts with tier one, the non negotiables, goes to tier two, deficiency to sufficiency. And then tier three is dismantling the diagnosis. That tends to be where we want to go. But if we work on tier one and tier two, that soil, we actually influence tier three without having to play target practice.
All right. Well, you covered a lot. I mean, you gave a lot of wonderful information. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked you? And if not, perhaps you could just summarize what steps people should take if they're interested in taking that functional nutrition approach.
Yeah, I think there's nothing I think we had a great conversation. So I feel like we did cover a lot of bases. I do want to just say that oftentimes we're overcomplicating the situation. So, for patients listening, I just want to remind patients that you actually have influence in the decisions that you make every day. And if you're struggling with a decision, that's where you can seek help. But I invite you to think about your non negotiables. And your non negotiables maybe not eating gluten. They may be saying, oh, she said sleep, poop, and blood sugar balance. I don't know how to do those, but that's what I'm going to go get help with, as opposed to my diagnosis, because I know this impacts the expression of my diagnosis. Also, I invite people to think about, what are your personal non negotiables that you know? For me, it's reading, it's spending time with my partner, my son, it's being out in nature, being in awe. I went to Iceland last summer. I'm going again this summer because, wow, the healing power of awe was just astounding to me. So I invite people to think about their personal non negotiables. It might be playing music or having more laughter or being with family more often. There's a lot of healing in that we're bypassing as we're stuck in this sympathetic dominant state, seeking the answer, when in fact it's multifactorial, it's all the things, and there's stuff you can do while you're on that quest.
Well said. And where can people find out more about you, Andrea?
Yeah, you can head over to andreanakayama.com, lots of A's, and that will lead you to all the places, back to the Functional Nutrition Alliance, where I train practitioners, to any writing and opportunities I have now, and to the 15-Minute Matrix podcast and any other podcasts like this one.
All right. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Andrea. Appreciate your time and sharing all your wonderful knowledge when it comes to functional nutrition.
Thank you so much.